what struck me, I think, as the most, critical, set of testimonies that we received, was really, quite early on when we heard some of the kind of witness testimony about, some families who have been in the state for a very long time, right? So we're talking about, African-American families who can trace their origins right back to the gold rush here in California. And so for me, that's really instrumental because, we have this narrative about the Black community or the African-American community in California as almost wholly being defined by the result of the Great Migration. We think about how, Black people, moved from the US South to California, largely to participate in the port industries that the state, has long been a part of. And so, to think about how we can move that timeline back, right, really to the inception of what we understand as a state of California, to me was really critical because it helps to open up the narrative of exactly what the relationship this state has to African Americans. And what we have in this report is, very much like my earlier answer, the potential to shift the narrative, right? And I think, while we are all in agreement that we are, anchoring this claim of reparations within the kind of process and experience and the structural relationship that African-American enslavement produced, what this report, will highlight are the many iterations of that, initial and foundational injustice. So what we've heard, in terms of testimony over the past several months are not only just how, slavery, has impacted, African-American circumstances, but how through multiple iterations of societal development, this community continues to be disadvantaged. And so what we have in this first report is, I think, one of the most comprehensive, accounting of that history, especially in a place like California, which, because it was, a so-called free state, and prohibited, formally prohibited slavery, although, enslavement, of course, did take place in the state. The narrative around, California as a so-called free state, somehow, adds this veneer, of innocence, right, around these issues. And so it's important that, this report actually helps to, articulate and represent the precise injuries that African Americans have lived with, for the entire history of the state, in fact. And so I agree. I think this will have, national import, certainly, influence the national dialogue around reparations, because we can take this California story and see how exactly the same movements around oppression of the African-American community has taken place even outside the scope of formal enslavement. The report too, or what we might think of as the second part of the life of the task force, really is taking everything that we've learned and gathered through, the first part, everything that comes up or will come up in report one, and trying to, provide an actual accounting of what these injuries were and what are the best methods for remedying and responding to them. And so what we're talking about in this kind of second part of the task force and what will come out of the second report, are actual proposals for reparations. And so, what's critical about that is that, we're dealing with very concrete with a very concrete basis of what we are talking about when we talk about the injuries that African Americans have faced. This has been what we've been doing explicitly for the first half of the life of the task force over the past several months. So we aren't talking about an abstract sense of reparation. We aren't talking about, a centuries ago, phenomenon or circumstance that we're somehow trying to drag into our present. We're talking about actually finding a way to account for a continuous experience of disenfranchisement, of dispossession, of discrimination. And so, in the second part, we're going to have to, as I said, take an accounting of this history, take an accounting of the ongoing practices. In other words, we have to be able to, trace the line from enslavement to contemporary gentrification of African Americans. And so reparations, as a kind of proposal or a set of proposals will have to account for that. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be beginning with what we would call the kind of question of eligibility. right? So we are in the state of California. We are dealing with African Americans who descend from the particular, what we might call the practice of enslavement in this country. So the first step is to define and to properly and I would say definitively qualify, the communities that we're talking about. From that point, we would then take into consideration all of the histories that we've gathered information on over the first, half of the life of the task force, and then begin to develop an accounting for how we are meant to bring a sense of satisfaction to these communities while accounting for the, the historical and ongoing, disparities that African Americans face. We will have something that looks like a figure. We will have something that looks like, attendant policies. We are aiming for what will be a very comprehensive model for what reparations looks like at the state level. The hope is that this can go on to then, for one, bring about reparations in the state of California for African Americans, but also to set an example for other states, and then hopefully actually push the national, the federal, discourse around reparations a bit further, given that, California will, have, cross the finish line, as it were, in actually putting forward a final proposal. So I think the takeaway, goes back to my earlier point about the narrative, right? I think, it's important for, California citizens to understand that this is a state issue. This isn't just an issue for the African-American community specifically. What we are trying to do with the task force, and what I'm at least trying to make, clear with my own, role in the task force, is that we aren't just talking about the injuries that African-Americans have faced. What we're trying to, make clear is that the cost of these injuries have actually been instrumental to what we might think of as a development of the state and its ongoing progress. And so when we're talking about the raising of Black communities to develop infrastructure like highways or, the Bay Area rapid transit system, we're talking about that African Americans have actually faced, the consequences and have paid the cost, for California's progress. And so this is the one thing that I want to kind of make clear to you today and to the audience. And this is, I think, will be, if it can be accomplished with the issuing of these two reports, that would be, I think, the greatest contribution, in fact, to the national discourse, is that, we aren't just talking about this period of, formal enslavement centuries ago. We're talking about the price that African Americans continue to pay, for the progress, of our nation and, of course, of the state. And it's not just about slavery, right? So it's not just about, having benefited directly from enslavement of African Americans. It's about, well, what is the actual political and economic model that slavery produced, for the kind of pattern by which American society has developed? And what are the newer ways that we're beginning to see, this practice of disadvantaging African Americans? And we can see that, as I said earlier, in the experience of massive gentrification, on scale, or we can see it in the more minute disparities of home appraisals between African Americans and white American homeowners. So here are the things that I want us to kind of make sure that we understand, is that slavery represents a foundation for this, but we aren't talking just about the practice of slavery. We're talking about the actual model for how African Americans have been incorporated, or not, in fact, into the fabric of American political and economic society. And so that's the real takeaway. It's a through line that will continue, in fact, if we don't finally have a reparative accounting for, for its ongoing development.